All right, here we are. I thought I would start doing some more long form content on YouTube and for other platforms. So I thought, what better way to start it off than to address something that someone once asked me. And the question was, what would I do if I had to start again? If I had to go back to the start of trying to achieve goals in the gym, be that nutrition, training, whatever the case may be. And how would I go about starting over, given the knowledge that I have now, in order to get results? And I thought this was a good question because they say knowledge is power, but knowledge is only power when it's applied. So I thought, what would I do with the knowledge that I have now from one, training for 18 plus years, 20 years, and being a coach for 16 of those years, plus education and coaching others. And the biggest thing that I would see if I went back and did this differently would be that it would be a much more efficient endeavor of getting results, because there's no such thing as a wrong way to do things. There's just an efficient and slightly less efficient way. So with that being said, a lot of the stuff I did at the start was very inefficient. It was taking advice from people that weren't the most intelligent or the most equipped to be giving advice in the first place. Opening bodybuilding magazines and seeing, the top bodybuilders, the top pros, Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, all this sort of people, and then trying to emulate what they were doing with their results, or taking advice from some of the PTs at the gyms that I trained at, who, if we go back 18, 20 years, the level of education for personal trainers was very scarce back then. There was no follow on for people to learn more and become better coaches outside of going to university and doing exercise physiology or nutrition or strength conditioning. And a lot of these people that did this extra study often didn't work in gyms. They were working with sports teams, they were working with universities, they were working in a more private setting. They weren't working at your local Anytime Fitness or whatever gym that you were training at. So there's the exposure to personal trainers at the start. Most of the trainers that were trying to give advice in the gym was a very, we didn't know it at the time, but very outdated, very rooted in assumption approach to getting results. The nutrition knowledge was shocking, the training knowledge was shocking, and a lot of the PTs in the gym and people in the gym were just trying to copy what Arnie did or what Ronnie Coleman did, or whoever the sports star that they followed did. So at the start, I was using way too many supplements from supplement stores, because you went into the supplement stores and they were run by the equivalent of a used car salesman of supplements. I was not training with any structure. I was not adhering to a decent enough nutrition plan. So I'm always a proponent for talking about the fundamentals, the fundamental basics, the things that make up the ground level, let's call it, of getting results. And that's specificity and quality in training. Obviously making sure that the training that you're doing is specific to the goals that you have, and that the quality is sufficient enough in terms of intensity, sets, reps, technique, etc. And then also, when we talk about the structure of our training, that what we're doing with our training is going to get us to the end goal. What I did at the start is I went in and picked a bunch of exercises that I thought that I needed to do. Bench, dead squats, all that sort of stuff. And I'm not saying these are bad exercises, because at the time they were a very popular basis of exercise. And then I would do them sporadically. My workouts would change depending on what equipment was available in the gym. So in regards to training, what would I do differently? I would be much more specific with my goal. And this is what I say to people now, is that when we are trying to reach a set goal, whether that's fat loss, gaining lean muscle, increasing exercise performance, whatever the case may be, that we are making sure that the training that we're applying ourselves to is specific to said goal. If you're training like a powerlifter when your goal is to be a bodybuilder, it's kind of counterintuitive to what you're doing. So I obviously train for two sort of split reasons. Obviously being better on in my chosen sports, which like martial arts, and also physique-based goals, gaining lean muscle tissue, being leaner, having a decent physique. So I would structure my training specifically to cater to that goal, rather than having an amalgamation of bits and pieces of everything and no specificity. And obviously the specificity refers to us being very intricate in, not intricate, but set in how we're trying to go about things. And us being set and having a structured plan allows us to then go, okay, cool, for the next 6 to 8 weeks, I'm going to adhere to this training block, which is specific to my goals and has sufficient choices of exercise, structure of our training, etc., which then allows us to get the results we want in a much more linear fashion, as opposed to bouncing all over the place, because you can't be adherent to one thing. The biggest thing as well, I used to mistake doing a lot for being intense with training and training hard. Okay, my workouts need to be an hour and a half, they need to be 2 hours, or I needed to come and do double sessions, or whatever the case is. And in doing this, I was just training like shit for a longer period of time, as opposed to being more intense, delivering intensity to my training sets, which would have got me the results much faster with a lot less time in the gym, as opposed to spending hours and hours and hours trying to get a result that was just, I was treading water, I wasn't really getting anywhere. So understanding intensity from the get-go, what it's like to train hard, not train a lot. So we got the training intensity, the specificity, and the structure in terms of training. Those are the things that I would be doing different if I had to start again. Now, in terms of nutrition, that was a funny one, and I didn't quite realize just how bad my approach to nutrition was at the start until I started studying nutrition and obviously coaching people and moving into the field and being more, I guess, specialized in that field. And my nutrition was the most bro science approach. It was like oats for breakfast, egg whites, yada, yada, yada. And I chose a diet method that was not sustainable. I was not going to stick to it. I was like 18, 19, and there was no need for me to be that restrictive with my food choices. And me being restrictive with my food choices often led to, the blowouts and the, swinging through KFC on the weekend and stuff like that. So I also had a social life, and my dieting structure did not match my social life, which usually meant one of two things. I would either miss out on the social life, which would obviously not make you very happy, or I would go off diet plan and that would also make me not happy. So I didn't pick a consistent, sustainable structure from the start because I didn't understand how to do that. And my calorie intake was so sporadic that I wasn't seeing the results that I was striving for, obviously putting on lean muscle. And if I could go back and do all this again, I would restart with a much more simplified approach. Obviously my goal was gaining muscle, so I've got to be in a calorie surplus, but also understanding the sort of foods that I needed to eat. Now, when we talk about calorie surplus, we want foods with a what's called very quick transit time, digestive transit time, which means the time it takes for us to go from one end to the other. And the reason we want this is because we don't want to be full all the time. We want to be hungry most of the time, because that hunger is going to allow us to eat more food, which is going to allow us to stay in a sufficient surplus, which is going to allow us to gain muscle tissue. So if we are always full, it's almost like having a room full of people and trying to fit more people in the room. It's just going to cause a backup, and you're going to have pushback and negative byproducts and things like that. And I used to eat like 2 cups of oats for breakfast, and oats they have a really high satiety score in terms of how full. It's a score of how full a food makes us. So with that being said, I was having a huge breakfast which sat in my guts like a brick, and then I wasn't hungry again until like early arvo. So I would be smarter with my food choices, picking foods that align more with my goal of trying to get more food in. I would not neglect fruit and vegetables. I would often have issues with digestion, so wasn't having enough fiber in my diet. And I've spoken about this in some of my short videos. With fiber, we want roughly 14 grams of fiber for each 1,000 calories that we consume. This ensures that we're having sufficient fiber intake to support proper digestion. With fiber intake, that fiber intake is also going to be a positive for our cardiovascular health. It's going to reduce the risk of heart disease and dysfunctions of the heart. So when we do that, we're ensuring health. And it's also going to improve our digestion, which is going to improve our health, but it's also going to make it easier for us to have more consistent input of food. Whereas if we're having digestive issues every other day, it's going to be very hard for us to want to eat more food, but also facilitate doing it. So I'd be much more structured with the foods that I was eating, the choice of foods. I would be much more adherent to the length of time I spent in a surplus. I would go through sporadic periods of high calories, then maintenance, and then you go through this structure. So a lot of people will stay in a deficit for way too long, but they won't stay in a surplus for long enough. And when we are in a surplus and we want to gain sufficient muscle tissue, we need to really wring the most potential out of that calorie surplus and the time with which we can stay in it while keeping body composition under control. I think I fell into that group of calling myself a hard gainer, which was total bullshit. Now that I look back on it, it was just me not eating enough consistently. And I look back on it now, like years later, I eventually got my calories up to a point where they were sufficient and I was eating enough, and I experienced what it was like to eat 4,500 calories, where it is a lot of food. And I was like, wow, I used to eat like a pigeon back then. No wonder I didn't grow. So much better food choice structure, a more consistent approach to the calorie intake that I was having. And the same applies for a calorie deficit. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm not seeing results. I'm not dropping any body fat. Okay, well, have you put a calorie deficit in place? Have you done it consistently? And has the calorie deficit been sufficient enough to drive the result that you're trying to achieve, which is fat loss? So better structure, better food choices. If we're in a deficit, we want to pick foods that have got a high satiety score, a higher food volume per calories, which is then going to offset the hunger that comes with being on lower calories. And in the surplus, we're going to obviously do the mirrored image, the opposite of that. I also didn't really factor in recovery. Recovery was not a thought in my mind. 4 hours sleep, 5 hours sleep, staying up, playing PlayStation or hanging out with the boys or whatever the case was, and wondering why I wasn't seeing results. And I would go into training sessions and I wasn't able to progress. I wasn't able to move more weight. Constantly having niggly little injuries and just not getting any stronger. And I would come in, I'd put so much effort into training, and it would get quite disheartening that I wasn't seeing those necessary results that came with the amount of work I was putting in. So obviously there was the nutrition and training structure aspect that did play a part, but I also wasn't prioritizing recovery. My sleep was quite shocking. Obviously back then I was undiagnosed for bipolar and ADHD, so that obviously played a part. So I wasn't really paying attention to my recovery, and this then carried over into diet structure not being the best, training structure not being the best. Another factor that, going back to the training aspect, is my execution of exercises was probably pretty pitiful, because there just wasn't enough people around teaching us how to move, teaching us how to train, teaching us how to go through these exercises efficiently, picking movements that align with the goals and then executing them properly. I think when I first started, we had PTs still telling people to keep their knees behind their toes in a squat, which is just factually massively incorrect. And if the people teaching people were teaching it wrong, you can see why it flows down as a cascade effect. So I think now with a lot of people, achieving your goals is easier than it ever has been, because the access to information is easier than it ever has been. there is the factor of having to sift through the information to find the correct type of information, because there is a lot of bullshit out there. So when you are absorbing information, it's important to do due diligence and make sure the person you're listening to has got experience in the trenches, they've got the relevant qualifications, they have the track record to prove that they can help you in a way that you need. When we take this in mind, we want to be a sponge when we first start. I was your typical 17, 18-year-old arrogant kid who didn't want to listen to anyone, thought that I knew better. I mean, I've read the Arnold's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. I know what I'm doing. And that potentially stopped me from listening to people who could potentially help me. Funny story off the back of that, the person who taught me how to squat correctly, I used to train at a gym in Perth, and I was in the gym one day and I was pretty heavy at that point in time. I was about 110, 115 kilos. And, I was squatting about 170, 180. And I'm going through my squats, going through my rep ranges, and I finished a set and I racked it. And this old guy, Eastern European sort of accent, walks past and he goes, "You squat like shit." And your first initial reaction is to go, "Well, fuck you, man." But I'm lucky enough that my dad told me when I was young that never discredit who you can learn information from, because the information you might learn might come from a really unlikely source. It took me a few years into my 20s to actually click with this, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to listen to this guy. And I said, okay, well, if I squat like shit, can you teach me not to squat like shit? And he's like, yeah, I can do that. And turns out that he used to work with Olympic and Commonwealth teams and high-level Olympic lifting teams back in Europe. So this person was the person that taught me how to squat and how to squat correctly. So I think that's something now that we need to be conscious of when we are starting in the gym. Just because someone's a massive meathead, or they're the supermodel looking chick or whatever the case is, and they look the part, it doesn't mean that they are qualified to give you the correct information. I'm not discrediting that there are some people who do have really amazing physiques who also are very intelligent, can help you, but there's also a lot that aren't. And when it comes to, for instance, this old guy from Europe, he was in his 50s, 60s, and I'm looking at his physique, and he's, not bad shape for his age, but he's definitely no Greek god. So that's where it's important for us to be a sponge, absorb information. And when I say absorb information, I don't mean absorb and believe everything. I mean, absorb it, take the information that you just learned, be critical of it, question it, ask questions. That's what you're there for. That's how you get better at things. And I think anyone who gives you information, I've said this in one of my seminars, that I might be teaching you something, but don't take what I'm saying as gospel. Listen to it, absorb it, question it, ask more questions, be critical of that information, because we don't want to trust blindly, because I've made that mistake earlier on in my coaching career. I went and did seminars and I listened to people with certain information, and it resulted in me then giving incorrect information to my clients, and I had to learn the hard way by eventually finding a research paper that disproved what this person was saying, or learning from someone who actually had the relevant qualifications to back up what they were saying, which is not a nice experience. So with everything I've said, we want to have a more structured approach to our training and nutrition, keep things simple, make sure what you're doing is specific to your goal, be that nutritional training, fat loss or muscle gain, exercise performance, or whatever the case is. Be mindful of your recovery. Don't expect to train really hard and diet and then sleep like shit. And then also be a sponge. Learn as much as you can. Find people who have done what you want to do and have got other people to be able to do what you've got to do. I mean, when you look at a coach, you want to see their track record. Have they been able to replicate the results in clients that you want to see in yourself? And then just be a sponge of that information. Soak it all up, question it, be critical of it, go away, do your own research. There's a lot of nice places like when you've got PubMed and Google Scholar and all that sort of stuff where you can read your own research papers and find decent information. And that's how I would be approaching starting from the very beginning of not being in a gym, not knowing anything. And I think going back now, I could probably achieve the results in a year that it took me 5 to 6 years to achieve previously, because the information with which I was using would be much more efficient at getting me that result. So with that being said, the end of this video, I will be releasing a lot more videos like this. I have been asked to do a myth busting video, which I shall be doing. But if you like this video, please leave a comment below, questions, anything you have in mind, and I will see you in the next one.